The gunshot cracked the morning stillness like a whip, sending a flock of startled ravens into the cloudless Wyoming sky. Yates Blackburn lowered his rifle, watching as the wounded buck stumbled, then fell among the sagebrush. His stomach tightened not from the kill, but from the knowledge that his children would have meat tonight. After 3 days of empty hands and emptier promises, he'd finally have something to bring home besides excuses. The year was 1878, and life on the frontier had never been kind, but it had grown particularly cruel since Martha's passing last winter. Childbirth had claimed her, along with what would have been their third child. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to expand their family, he'd lost the woman who held it together. Yates wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hand rough against his sunburned skin. At 32, he felt twice his age, worn down by grief and responsibility. He'd come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier with Martha and their infant son, chasing rumors of cheap land and opportunity. They'd found the land right enough, but opportunity was as elusive as rain in August. He field-dressed the deer with practiced efficiency, his thoughts drifting to his children waiting back at their small homestead. Samuel, now 6, was old enough to understand his mother wasn't coming back, but 4-year-old Elizabeth still asked for her mama sometimes, especially at night. Those moments cut deeper than any knife. With the meat secured to his horse, Yates mounted up and headed home. The journey took just over an hour, the familiar landscape of rolling hills and scattered pines offering little comfort. As he crested the final ridge and their modest cabin came into view, something was different. Smoke rose from the chimney, unusual for midday, and there was movement on the porch that didn't belong to his children. Instinctively, his hand moved to his holstered revolver. Strangers weren't uncommon, but they weren't always welcome either. The territory still had its share of outlaws and drifters with ill intent. He urged his horse forward, alert and cautious. As he drew closer, he could make out a wagon parked beside the cabin that hadn't been there when he left at dawn. A woman he didn't recognize was sitting on the porch steps with Elizabeth on her lap, reading from what looked like a small book. Samuel was nowhere in sight. "Hello there." The woman called out, shading her eyes against the sun as she noticed his approach. She had a gentle voice with just a hint of a southern accent. Yates dismounted, keeping his hand near his gun. "Madam," he replied cautiously, "may I ask what brings you to my home?" The woman stood, settling Elizabeth carefully on her feet. His daughter immediately ran to him, her pigtails bouncing. "Papa, Miss Tess made flapjacks with honey," Elizabeth exclaimed, wrapping her arms around his legs. The stranger smiled apologetically. "I'm Teresa Sullivan, but everyone calls me Tess. I was passing through on my way to Laramie when my wagon wheel cracked about a mile back. Your children were outside alone, and the little one was crying. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty of fixing them something to eat." Yates looked past her to the open cabin door. From inside came Samuel's voice, singing a tune Yates didn't recognize. The scent of coffee and something sweet drifted through the air. "Samuel's helping clean up," Tess explained. "He's quite the responsible young man." Yates felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. He hadn't intended to be gone so long, but tracking the deer had taken him farther than expected. The children knew to stay inside when he was hunting, but they often grew restless. "I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Sullivan, but I wouldn't want to impose, miss," she corrected gently. "And it's no imposition. Children need looking after, and they were hungry." There was no judgment in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. For the first time, Yates really looked at her. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, though wayward strands had escaped to frame her face. Her dress was plain but clean, and something about her steady gaze suggested a woman who'd seen her share of hardship but hadn't been broken by it. "You mentioned a broken wagon wheel," she nodded. "Yes, I've been traveling since my husband passed last year. I was a schoolteacher back in Missouri, heading to Laramie to take a position there." "I'm sorry for your loss," Yates said automatically, though the words felt hollow coming from him who understood such grief all too well. "As I am for yours," she replied softly. "Your son mentioned his mother is in heaven." Yates swallowed hard. "Since last winter." Something passed between them then, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain that needed no elaboration. "Papa, I'm hungry." Elizabeth tugged at his trousers. "Can Miss Tess stay and eat with us? She makes good food." Yates glanced at the deer carcass tied to his horse. "I've brought venison." "It'll take some time to prepare, but you're welcome to join us, Miss Sullivan. Least I can do is offer you a meal while I see about fixing your wagon wheel." Tess hesitated, then smiled. "I'd be grateful, Mr. Blackburn, and please call me Tess." "Yates," he offered in return. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face lighting up at the sight of his father and the deer. "You got one, Pa. We're going to eat good tonight." "That we are, son. Come help me with this." As Yates and Samuel worked on preparing the deer for cooking, Tess kept Elizabeth entertained while simultaneously preparing vegetables from Yates's modest garden. The domesticity of the scene struck him as both foreign and achingly familiar. A woman in his kitchen, the sound of a child's laughter. The table set for more than just him and the children. By the time they sat down to eat, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the cabin windows. Yates hadn't realized how hungry he was until the first bite of venison stew crossed his lips. Tess had added herbs he didn't even know he had, transforming what would have been a plain meal into something remarkable. The children chattered happily, responding to Tess's gentle questions about their day and what they'd learned from the book she'd read them. Watching her with them, Yates felt something inside him shift, like a door long rusted shut was being carefully pried open. When Elizabeth dropped her spoon and it clattered to the floor, Tess retrieved it without missing a beat in her conversation with Samuel about constellations. She wiped it clean, handed it back to the girl, and continued explaining how sailors used stars to navigate the oceans. "You're good with them," Yates said when the children had finally gone to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day. They sat on the porch, the night air cool but not uncomfortable. Crickets chirped in the distance, and somewhere an owl called out to the darkness. Tess smiled, cradling a cup of coffee between her hands. "I've been teaching children for nearly 8 years. You learn a thing or two about what makes them tick." "I wish I had your patience," Yates admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm failing them with every decision I make." "They seem well loved and cared for to me," Tess said. "That's more than many children have." They fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling with words. After a while, Tess spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "My husband John was a good man, but restless. Always chasing the next opportunity, the next town, the next adventure. We never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots." She traced the rim of her cup with her finger. "I think that's why I wanted to go to Laramie, to finally stop moving." Yates understood that desire. "Martha and I came here for a fresh start. She believed in this place more than I did sometimes. Said we were building something that would last." His throat tightened. "Now I'm just trying to hold onto what's left. It's not easy, is it, moving forward when part of you is still looking back?" He nodded, grateful for her understanding. "The children help. They need me to keep going, so I do." The conversation shifted to more practical matters. Tess's wagon wheel, which Yates had examined earlier and determined would need replacing rather than repair, and her journey to Laramie. "The stage comes through Clearwater in 2 days," he said, referring to the small settlement 15 miles east. "I can take you there if you'd like. Your wagon should be fixed by then." "I'd appreciate that," she replied. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "It's no imposition," he found himself saying. "In fact, it's nice having someone else around." The next morning, Yates woke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in the kitchen. For a disorienting moment, he thought it was Martha, before reality settled over him like a heavy blanket. Rising quietly, he dressed and stepped into the main room to find Tess showing Samuel how to properly crack eggs into a bowl without getting shells in the mix. "Good morning," she greeted him warmly. "I hope you don't mind, but the children were up early and I thought we might as well make breakfast." "Morning, Pa," Samuel grinned proudly. "I'm helping." Elizabeth sat at the table, carefully placing forks beside the plates, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to get them straight. "I don't mind at all," Yates said, surprised by how easily they'd all fallen into this routine, as if Tess had always been there. After breakfast, he set about working on Tess's wagon, replacing the cracked wheel with a spare he'd been saving. Samuel followed him outside, eager to help, while Tess and Elizabeth remained in the cabin, where Tess had offered to give the little girl a reading lesson. "Miss Tess is nice, isn't she, Pa?" Samuel asked as he handed Yates tools. "Yes, she is, son. Do you think she'll stay for a while? Elizabeth likes her a lot." Yates paused, not wanting to encourage false hopes. "Miss Sullivan has a job waiting for her in Laramie. She's just passing through." Samuel's face fell. "Oh, but couldn't she stay here? We have room, and she makes you smile." "Does she now?" Yates felt heat rise to his face. "Yep, you don't smile much anymore, but you did last night at dinner. A lot." Out of the mouths of babes, Yates thought. He hadn't realized his son was so observant. "Well, it was a good dinner," he deflected. "Mama would like her," Samuel said confidently. "She always said you needed someone to keep you from being so serious all the time." Yates had no response to that. Martha had indeed often teased him about his solemn nature, countering it with her own vibrant spirit. The thought that she would approve of Tess's presence was both comforting and unsettling. By midday, the wagon wheel was replaced and the axle greased. Tess had prepared a simple lunch of leftover venison and fresh bread. She'd baked that morning bread that filled the cabin with a scent so homey. It made Yates's chest ache with longing. They ate outside under the shade of the old cottonwood tree, the children chattering excitedly as Tess told them stories about the Mississippi River and the steamboats she'd seen as a girl. "Have you always been a teacher?" Yates asked when the children had run off to play. Tess shook her head. "My father wanted me to marry young, but my mother insisted I get an education first. I went to a women's college in St. Louis, then taught at a small school in our town until I met John. He was passing through, working for the railroad. Swept me off my feet, as they say." Her smile was tinged with nostalgia. "We were married 2 months later, and I followed him from job to job, teaching where I could. And now Laramie. Yes, the town is growing and they're in need of qualified teachers. The letter said I'd have a class of 20 children, ages 6 to 12. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "It'll be different being in one place after so much moving about." "You'll do well there," Yates said, surprising himself with how certain he felt. "You have a gift with children." Her cheeks colored at the compliment. "Thank you. I've always believed that education is the greatest gift we can give the next generation. Knowledge opens doors that might otherwise remain closed." Martha felt the same way, Yates found himself saying. She was teaching Samuel his letters before he could even talk properly. "Had plans for a small school right here on our land someday. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Yates looked out at the landscape, at the dream they'd built together. This place was as much hers as mine, sometimes more so. Later that afternoon, a summer storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering over the mountains to the west. Yates helped Tess move her wagon closer to the barn for shelter, then hurried to secure what he could around the property. The rain came suddenly, and with force, driving them all inside. Elizabeth, frightened by a loud crack of thunder, clung to Tess, who soothed her with quiet words and gentle strokes of her hair. "The angels are just moving their furniture," Tess told her, an explanation that made the little girl giggle despite her fear. As the storm raged outside, they gathered around the table for an impromptu lesson. Tess had found a slate and some chalk in her wagon, and she patiently showed Elizabeth how to form her letters while Samuel worked on simple addition and subtraction. Yates watched them from his chair by the fireplace, ostensibly mending a torn shirt, but mostly just observing the scene before him. There was something about Tess's presence that filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. The storm continued well into the evening, making it clear that Tess wouldn't be leaving that day. After the children were asleep, she joined Yates by the fire again, accepting the coffee he offered. "I hope the weather clears by tomorrow," she said. "I've already delayed your routine far too long." "What routine?" Yates replied with a wry smile. "Getting up, working until I drop, falling asleep worried about the next day. You've been a welcome interruption, Miss Sullivan," she laughed softly. "Tess, remember, and thank you for saying that, it's been lonely on the road." "I understand lonely," he said quietly. Their eyes met over the rim of her cup, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared experience that transcended the brief time they'd known each other. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had never happened. Tess announced at breakfast that she would be leaving after the meal, hoping to make it to Clearwater by nightfall to catch the stage the following day. The children's protests were immediate and heartfelt. "But you can't go," Elizabeth wailed, tears welling in her big eyes. "Who will read me stories?" "Your papa can read to you," Tess assured her, though she looked pained at the child's distress. "It's not the same," Samuel said solemnly. "He doesn't do the voices like you do." Yates felt torn between sympathy for his children's attachment and awareness that Tess had her own life, her own plans that didn't include them. He couldn't ask her to stay, no matter how right it felt having her there. "Children, Miss Sullivan has a job waiting for her," he explained gently. "Many children in Laramie need a teacher just like you need your pa. We can't keep her all to ourselves." Tess gave him a grateful look, though he noticed her eyes were suspiciously bright. "I'll write to you," she promised the children, "and perhaps someday I can visit again." The preparations for her departure were subdued. Yates helped load her few belongings back into the wagon while the children picked wildflowers to give her as a parting gift. When it was time to say goodbye, Elizabeth clung to Tess's skirts, refusing to let go until Tess knelt down and whispered something in her ear that made the little girl nod solemnly and step back. "What did you tell her?" Yates asked as he helped Tess up onto the wagon seat. "That sometimes goodbye just means until we meet again," she replied softly. "Thank you for everything, Yates. Your kindness has meant more than you know." He took her hand before she could pull away. "Safe travels, Tess. Laramie will be lucky to have you." As he watched her wagon grow smaller in the distance, Samuel standing on one side of him and Elizabeth on the other, Yates felt a heaviness settle over him that had nothing to do with the weight of his children's hands in his. "She's gone, isn't she, Pa?" Samuel asked, his voice small. "Yes, son. She's gone." The days that followed were harder than Yates had expected. The children were listless and quiet, and he found himself thinking of Tess at odd moments, wondering if she'd made it safely to Laramie, if her teaching position was everything she'd hoped for, if she ever thought of them. A week passed, then two. Summer was beginning its slow transition to fall, the nights growing cooler, the days shorter. Yates worked from sunrise to sunset, determined to prepare for winter better than he had the previous year. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel brought him a letter that had arrived with a neighbor returning from Clearwater. "It's from Miss Tess," his son announced, his face alight with excitement. "Can we read it now?" Yates examined the envelope, his heart quickening at the sight of her neat handwriting. "After supper," he promised. The letter was everything the children had hoped for, full of stories about Laramie, descriptions of her new students, and questions about their days. She'd included a small packet of candy for each child and a book of simple poems she thought Elizabeth might enjoy. What caught Yates's attention, however, was the postscript at the end, written in a more hurried hand. "I find my thoughts returning to your homestead more often than I should admit. The school term ends in December. Perhaps I might visit again, if the invitation still stands." That night, after the children were asleep, Yates sat at the table and wrote his reply by lamplight. He wasn't a man of many words, especially written ones, but he found himself filling page after page, telling her about the harvest preparations, the children's progress with their studies, and yes, extending an explicit invitation to visit whenever she wished. He didn't dare put into words the growing certainty in his heart that those few days with her had awakened something he thought had died with Martha. Instead, he signed off simply with, "You would be most welcome here, any time." Fall arrived in earnest, bringing with it the harvest and the first frosts. The children's birthdays came and went, Samuel turning 7 and Elizabeth 5 within weeks of each other. Yates did his best to make the days special, though he knew his efforts fell short of what Martha would have managed. Letters from Tess arrived regularly now, once or twice a month. The children looked forward to them eagerly, and Yates found himself equally anticipating her words, the glimpses into her life in Laramie, and the warmth that seemed to flow from the pages. In late November, as the first snows began to dust the hills, Yates received a letter that made his pulse race. Tess wrote that the school term would end on December 18th, and if the weather permitted travel, she hoped to spend Christmas at their homestead before deciding her next steps. "She's coming back," Elizabeth squealed when he shared the news. "For real, if the weather allows," Yates cautioned, not wanting to raise hopes too high. Winter travel could be dangerous, especially for a woman alone, but the prospect of seeing Tess again spurred him to action. Over the next few weeks, he repaired things around the cabin he'd been putting off, built a new shelf for the kitchen, and even rode to Clearwater to purchase fabric for new curtains, which a neighbor's wife helped him sew. "You're mighty interested in fixing up the place all of a sudden," the woman commented with a knowing smile. "Wouldn't have anything to do with that teacher lady the children keep talking about, would it?" Yates felt his ears burn. "Just trying to make the place presentable," he muttered. The woman patted his arm. "It's been long enough, Yates. Martha wouldn't want you mourning forever." December arrived with merciful mildness, the weather cold but clear, the roads passable. As the 18th approached, Yates found himself growing increasingly restless, checking and rechecking preparations for Tess's arrival. He'd arranged for her to travel with the mail coach that made weekly runs between Laramie and Clearwater, and he planned to meet her there on the 19th. The children were beside themselves with excitement, counting down the days with marks on a calendar he'd fashioned from a piece of scrap wood. When the day finally came, Yates rose before dawn, dressed in his best shirt, freshly washed and mended, and hitched the horses to the wagon. The children, bundled against the cold, could barely contain themselves during the journey to Clearwater. The small settlement was busier than usual, people gathering supplies for Christmas and winter provisions. Yates kept his eye on the road from the east, watching for the familiar silhouette of the mail coach. When it finally appeared, a dark shape against the bright winter sky, Samuel spotted it first. "There it is, Pa. Do you think Miss Tess is really on it?" "We'll find out soon enough," Yates replied, trying to keep his own anticipation in check. The coach pulled up to the general store, which also served as the mail station. The driver jumped down, opened the door, and extended his hand to help a passenger descend. And there she was, Tess, wrapped in a blue wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes immediately searching the small crowd. When she spotted them, her face broke into a smile that rivaled the winter sun for brightness. "Miss Tess." Elizabeth broke free from Yates's hold and ran toward her, Samuel close behind. Tess knelt to embrace them both, laughing as they spoke over each other in their excitement to tell her everything she'd missed. Yates approached more slowly, suddenly uncertain. What if he'd built this reunion up too much in his mind? What if she'd changed her feelings, or never had the ones he'd attributed to her? But then she looked up, still holding the children, and her eyes met his. Something passed between them, a current of understanding and longing that made his doubts evaporate like morning mist. "Hello, Yates," she said simply, her voice carrying all the warmth of summer despite the December chill. "Welcome back, Tess." He offered his hand to help her up, and when their fingers touched, he knew with certainty that this was right. The journey home was filled with chatter, the children competing for Tess's attention while she somehow managed to make each feel heard and valued. Yates mostly listened, content to have her beside him on the wagon seat, her presence filling a space that had been empty for too long. As they approached the homestead, Yates felt a sudden nervousness. Would she find it too plain, too rough compared to Laramie? Had his improvements been enough? "You've been busy," Tess remarked as they pulled up to the cabin, noting the fresh split firewood stacked neatly by the door, the new curtains visible through the windows, the general air of care that hadn't been there during her last visit. "Wanted to make sure everything was ready for winter," he said, not quite meeting her eye. Her smile suggested she saw through his excuse, but she simply said, "It looks wonderful." That evening, after a simple but satisfying supper, with the children finally asleep after insisting on just one more story from Tess, they sat by the fire, much as they had months before. The familiar scene felt like a continuation rather than a repetition, as if no time had passed at all. "How was your term in Laramie?" Yates asked, genuinely interested in her work. Tess considered the question. "Rewarding in many ways. The children were eager to learn and the town was welcoming." She paused, gazing into the fire, but something was missing. "I thought putting down roots would be enough, but I've realized it matters where those roots go." Yates's heart quickened at her words. "And have you decided where they should go?" She looked at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I thought I knew when I left here in the summer. I was so certain Laramie was the answer, but then I kept thinking about this place, about the children." A slight hesitation. "About you. We've thought about you too," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "More than I can say." Tess set her cup down and turned fully toward him. "I've been offered the teaching position again for the spring term. The school board was quite insistent, in fact." Yates felt his hope falter. "I see. Well, Laramie is growing fast. They need good teachers." "Yes, they do." She reached out and tentatively placed her hand over his. "But there are children here who need me too, aren't there?" The implication of her words hung in the air between them, a question that needed answering. Yates turned his hand to clasp hers properly. "There are children here who love you," he said carefully, "and a man who has come to care for you more deeply than he thought possible after losing so much." Tess's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I was so afraid to admit how I felt. It seemed too soon, too complicated. You're still grieving, and the children adore you, Yates interrupted gently. And yes, I will always grieve for Martha in some way, but she would want all of us to be happy. And these past months, the only times I've truly felt happy were when your letters arrived, or when I allowed myself to imagine you here again. A single tear escaped down Tess's cheek. I've turned down the position in Laramie, she confessed. I told them I had another opportunity I needed to pursue. And what opportunity is that? Yates asked, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she must hear it. I thought perhaps I might open a small school here. Not just for your children, but for others in the area. Many of the homesteaders have children who receive little formal education. Martha's dream, Yates whispered, amazed at how perfectly their visions aligned. But I would need a place to stay, Tess continued, her voice gaining confidence. A home. Yates squeezed her hand. I know a place that could use a woman's touch. It's not much, but it's solid, and there's room for a school nearby. And the man who owns this place, would he welcome a woman who's still finding her way but knows where her heart belongs? He would welcome her with open arms, Yates said, his voice thick with emotion. If she's certain this is what she wants. Tess's answer was to lean forward and place a gentle kiss on his lips, brief but full of promise. I've never been more certain of anything. The following morning, Yates rose early as usual, intending to let Tess sleep late after her journey. But as he entered the main room, he found her already up, preparing breakfast while the children set the table, following her gentle instructions with unusual enthusiasm. For a moment he stood in the doorway, taking in the scene, his children happy and engaged, Tess moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there, the table set for 4, no empty chair to remind them of what they'd lost. Elizabeth spotted him first. Papa. Miss Tess is showing me how to make griddle cakes. Tess turned, a smile warming her features when she saw him. Good morning. I hope you don't mind that we started breakfast without you. Not at all, he replied, moving into the room. As he approached the table, something about the scene struck him with such poignancy that words escaped before he could consider them. Stay, he said softly, meeting her eyes across the table. The table feels right again. Tess's expression softened with understanding. I'm not going anywhere, she promised, reaching for his hand across the table. Not anymore. The children looked between them, confused but sensing something important was happening. Does this mean Miss Tess is staying forever? Samuel asked hopefully. Yates looked at Tess, letting her see all that was in his heart. If she'll have us, yes, forever. I will, Tess whispered, her eyes never leaving his. Forever sounds just right. The spring wedding was small but joyful, held on the homestead with neighbors and friends gathered to witness the union. Elizabeth, dressed in a new frock Tess had sewn for the occasion, scattered wildflower petals along the path, while Samuel stood proudly beside his father, holding the simple gold band that had once belonged to Tess's grandmother. By summer, the small schoolhouse was completed, built with the help of neighboring families whose children would benefit from Tess's teaching. It stood just beyond the vegetable garden, a testament to Martha's dream and Tess's determination. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in shades of orange and pink, the children playing in the yard, their laughter a soundtrack to the life they were building together. Are you happy? Yates asked one such evening, his arm around his wife's shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. Tess looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. Completely. Are you? He thought about how far they'd come from grief and uncertainty to this moment of peace and belonging. "I never thought I'd find this again," he admitted. "A family, a home that feels whole." "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns," Tess said, placing her hand over his. "I came west looking for a school and found a family instead." From inside the cabin came the sound of a pot boiling over, and they both laughed, rising together to attend to it. As they entered the cabin, Yates paused in the doorway, watching Tess move confidently through what was now undeniably their home. The table was set for supper, 4 places, with a 5th smaller setting for the baby they were expecting in the fall. Everything about the scene spoke of permanence, of roots growing deep into Wyoming soil, of a future built on love and second chances. "Stay," he whispered again, though she couldn't hear him from across the room. The words were a prayer of gratitude now, not a plea. "The table feels right again." And as if she sensed his thoughts, Tess looked up and smiled, the answer in her eyes as clear as the day they'd met. She was home and she was staying, for all the days to come.